Welcome to the Stewart Squared podcast, where me and my father go back into the history to understand where the future is going. And that's actually a good question to start with because you've had a career of trying to predict the future with skin in the game. And what separates those people who can predict the future with skin in the game and those who kind of just make meaningless predictions based with no incentive to actually follow up on it? Because that seems like a core problem that our societies face, is that anybody can go online and make all sorts of crazy predictions about the future and are not held accountable unless there's like people who are paying attention.
And that goes to politics too, because a lot of what Trump does is say crazy things that'll generate memes that people who never actually listen to what he said will go, "Oh, this Trump guy knows what's going on." So there's like this disconnection from saying and having the effect. Um, and it's you say skin in the game. That's an interesting concept, but you have to live with your predictions, right? And I have a reputation, and people remember who I am, even if I'm not that visible now, because I was right a lot. And uh, so when you hear people talk about politics, AI, any of the stuff that's kind of top of mind in society in general, 98% of the people are just like mouthing off. And um, you have to find the 2% that actually know what they're talking about, and then kind of listen to them and then compare notes and decide, which one you believe. Hopefully that 2% has a range of opinions about what's going to happen. Uh, so that, I mean, this is relevant to AI in the sense that you turned me on to Numenta, the guy who's CEO of that company, where they use the brain as the benchmark for AI in all regards. The fact that it takes 0.2 of a watt to operate in real time and takes everything in and spits reality back out. Well, not sure it's reality, but spits understanding back out. AI can't do that, and the ability to do that probably means there's still another 20 years before we get to
Real intelligence.
artificial general intelligence. And so I know enough from the history that when you turned me on to Numenta, I like tracked back to where I first started learning about AI in the 80s, and then all the things that happened in between, and the sort of timeline between each major event, right? The natural language processing was kind of the first step, and they didn't know that there was a whole bunch of other stuff to come, and including neural networks and all the stuff that's been developed, and including the large language models. So there's time in between each of these things, and so you can kind of look forward and say, well, if the next thing is this, it's going to take another 10 years to get there, even if people are investing billions of dollars and these companies are doing all this crazy stuff. Like I'm sitting here watching what's going on right now with AI and going, okay, OpenAI is going to raise more money at
150 billion.
And that's fine, because I mean they're generating like 5 billion of revenue anyway, so there is a metric for them. Particularly if it keeps growing that fast, which it may not. But the other companies haven't figured out actually generate any revenue, so they're like valued at billions of dollars, and they're not. They're not generating any revenue. There's no sort of fundamental business proposition. And even Microsoft, which is using OpenAI and is being criticized because their version of it, Copilot, is not being adopted, right? People actually aren't using it because to some degree they can't figure out the difference between what they were doing and what Copilot is. And this is where Apple is coming in, and people are really hugely skeptical of what Apple will do, but it's the thing that they do, which is they operate on behalf of the individual consumer. And so maybe they'll screw it up. Haven't seen it yet, but if anybody's going to figure out how to have real benefit for the end user, it'll probably be Apple, maybe. Anyway, so you can kind of see all this stuff, and I've learned this, 40 years ago. Well, I started to learn it 40 years ago. over time, in the first 10 years of doing this, I figured out the patterns and, what to look for.
So in the 1980s, maybe we could take it back to 83 or 84, and we don't have to focus this on AI, but if there's any natural language kind of foundational technologies, but other things about hardware and software, what type of predictions were you making in like 83, 84? Were you making predictions at that time, or did that come later?
Yeah, later. So 83 is when I started as editor-in-chief of InfoWorld. It's when, before you were born, we all moved to California. And I took over as the editor of InfoWorld. And I'd been doing it for a year. And before that, I'd edited Inc. magazine. So I had some clue, right? Physicalc and all the early stuff. But InfoWorld was really more of a trade magazine. Didn't like to think of that. But all the people that were reading InfoWorld were looking for kind of, holy
What's going to
Christ, look
happen
at all
next?
out, like report on it and tell us about it. And that's what InfoWorld's function was, is to report on the new stuff, which the new stuff was happening every week, day really, but none of the mainstream publications were covering personal computing at the time because it was still this kind of little thing in the big world. So what I did for the first 10 years was to be smart enough to know which things were important time they were announced. But then I started to develop the pattern recognition to go, well, this thing happened and then this thing happened. And so then you can kind of look forward and say, if this thing happens, then that thing will happen. And so I started getting more and more into making predictions, but that was really only a year out. But just that, given the speed of how things were developing, was being able to say what would happen next year. And that's, if you ultimately go back and look at it, I started doing a newsletter and then I did a conference, and the way we named the conference was Agenda Next Year. So Agenda 88 happened in 1987. So we set the agenda for 1988 and rolling forward. It was a little minor boldness on my part to say that this conference would predict what would happen the next year, and it was still moving so fast. But now if you're talking about things like AI or satellite communications or this other stuff, it's more like 5 years.
So I tried to look up on Perplexity just now as you were talking about for any information on Agenda 88, Agenda 88 in 87. But it only brought me to the mainframe prediction in March 1991, saying that we're gonna unplug the mainframes on March 15th, 1996. Now, what I'm noticing from what I want is to be able to search all of those magazines that you wrote on AI, but that is not possible. How can we make that happen?
Most of them never got archived online.
Oh no, so they're gone?
Yeah, so like boy, you have to pick like I wrote for Fortune.
Yeah.
Look for Alsop on Infotech, Fortune magazine, and you'll see some of them, right? Because I was writing that in 91 to 96.
Yeah.
So there would just be the internet, and magazines and publications started worrying about archiving themselves so that they would persist. But they were much more worried about their jobs. What was the advertising model of the internet, and how do we make money, and are we going to still have jobs? And so they weren't paying a lot of attention to wrote the Alsop column for Fortune magazine from 96 to 2003, right? That's when the internet started. So this is a really good case because Time Inc. that published Fortune could never figure out the internet. So Time owned Time magazine, Life magazine, Fortune magazine. I mean, they were the biggest magazine publisher in the world, and they could not figure out how to deal with the internet. And they tried various things that didn't work, mainly because the individual publications ran their own business and they hated to cooperate with the other magazines. And so they originally did something called Pathfinder, which was a total disaster. And then each of the publications was allowed to do their own website. But by that time, they'd already lost a lot of their archive. So yeah, through this whole thing, that does have my career. They're doing a pretty good job. Um, and if you go back before that, before 96, like by 96, Infowell was already almost out of business, and they weren't worrying about archiving, the
Yeah.
last 12 publishing. So my father's columns are almost impossible to find online because there was no internet before he died. And uh, and indeed the publications that he wrote for, all of them are no longer exist.
Mm.
So maybe Newsweek exists and maybe there's some kind of archive there, but Saturday Evening Post went out of business in 1968 and didn't have a chance at the internet. And the International Herald Tribune Syndicate, which published his and Uncle Joe's columns, went out of business even earlier. So, the arrival of the internet as a marker. Before that, it's very hard to find stuff. After it started, it's still hard to find stuff until people really figured out archiving and publishing and on the internet. So, when I stopped writing in 2003, I kind of had that worked out. So stuff after that is, even though I just read a story about the music industry stored a lot of its music archives on hard disks, and those hard disks don't work anymore. So they've actually lost a significant portion of their original recordings of music. And so, I mean, it's still a problem.
Yeah.
It's still a constant problem.
And I just asked Perplexity for find articles from Stewart Alsop in 2005, and it couldn't. It did bring up probably from my grandfather Library of Congress, so something from him, and also a picture of our grandfather. And I want to point out that I believe that this is an AI generated image from Perplexity of you, unless you remember. This is a really
No, I know where that came from. That's on our website.
Oh, got it. So that's from your website. Okay. And so this is a really interesting problem that we've stumbled on. I know that you've already been dealing with this because we're trying to digitize all the articles that you did save from my grandfather.
Right.
And I forgot to mention, I'm reading the book right now, Taking on the World. I'm rereading it about your Uncle Joe and your father, Stewart Alsop, my grandfather. Fascinating, great time to reread it. And so there's this problem of we can't document all this stuff that I want to try to document with the show. And the Internet Archive, is the Internet Archive trying to go back before 1996, before 2003, really?
No, it's only from the first instance of the internet. It's the Internet Archive. So
Yeah.
I don't, the question to ask, would it also archive the internet before it became commercial? Right. The internet was actually invented in the late 80s, late 90s, excuse me. And when I went to Infowell in 96, that's when I became a VC. So I have to remember how this worked out. I was at Infowell from 91 to 95. And that's when the internet started to show up.
Yeah.
Right. And I think I told you this anecdote, but I'm sitting there on my Windows PC at the time. I didn't use a Mac. And that was what we used to write and publish Infowell. The back end is a whole nother story, but so I'm sitting there at my PC hearing about this thing called Mozilla, this internet browser, and I go, I need to get that. Well, we didn't have like online app stores and stuff like that, so I had to go to the IT department and say, what is this Mozilla and how do I get it? So they gave me a floppy disk, and I stuck the floppy disk and installed it on the computer, and then I suddenly could see the internet. But you couldn't see the internet until you had the web browser as an application, unless you did it on terminal and knew how to do that, which most people didn't.
Yeah.
So that moment where you go, how do I get on the internet? Only like say in 94, which is when I did that. The and I spent the next 3 weeks browsing. I didn't pay any attention to the info, so I was like obsessed. Probably 3 months actually, but and you know, it was obvious to anybody that did it, but the number of people who did it was like this little tiny fraction of the population, right, who had been in the computer industry and had some reason to know about the internet and go try to figure out how to get on it. And until like 96 now, I became a VC. And by then, the venture capitalists knew this was all going on. Some of the early investments had paid off.
Yeah.
And so I was really hired as the internet guy at NEA.
Oh, interesting. So the internet made your career. And this is really funny because I'm trying to remember when I got on the internet. And I wonder if I caught any of that enthusiasm, or did that only happen at the office? Were you were in an office you weren't on Sand Hill Road. Where were you? Where was that when you found the internet?
So again, before you were born, we moved to and bought a house in Redwood City. And at that time, InfoWorld was in Palo Alto.
Yeah.
They were on the third floor of the tall building there on
In El Camino?
not El Camino, the University Avenue.
University
It was
Avenue.
actually University Avenue. Now I can't remember what the name of the street was, but it was one of the like three tall buildings, which is like 8 stories in Palo Alto. And we moved within us moving out there and buying the house in Redwood City. We moved from Menlo Park to Palo Alto, and that's where we were.
Oh,
Now, later on, we moved back to Menlo Park.
yeah. Back to Redwood City. Because I was
No, we lived in Redwood City, but InfoWorld moved back to Menlo Park.
Oh, InfoWorld moved.
No, I got it the other way around. When they were in Palo Alto when we moved out, and then we moved to Menlo Park, and so we moved to. It wasn't Sand Hill Road. It was trying to remember the name of the road.
Middlefield?
Yeah, I think it was Middlefield. It's the exit off of 101.
Yeah, no, I remember that. Yeah.
And we were in the second story of a 2-story building, and the first story was one of the. I think it had already gone public. It was a data storage company or something like that, which I can't remember the name of. So we were right in the middle of the office parks where Silicon Valley took off.
Yeah.
So and then we were there, and I got fired a year later. So I was a year in that office, and
that's where you found the internet.
And that's where I found the internet.
And so you just walked into the IT guy, and
no,
now
wait a minute, that I did not find the internet then. It was when I went back to InfoWorld. So I was fired, and I started my newsletter in 1985, and then conference in 1987, second conference demo in like 89, and then IDG came and recruited me back as editor-in-chief of InfoWorld in 91. And so I tried to do both things at once. That didn't really work very well. I was largely absent for early life as I was doing 2 jobs at once. I was working like 12 a day and traveling a lot, and that was probably not a good decision.
Well, whatever. It's all in the past. So the internet, and I'm trying to figure out, because I got on the internet, I remember AOL. I remember connecting downstairs at the Brewster Avenue house. There was a computer, and I was getting onto AOL, and I would get into the chat rooms and stuff like that. That was probably 97. So I probably missed the internet from 94 to 97 while you were
94. Nobody had it, right? It was the only people that had it were academics. It was a private, not-for-profit network. Originated by DARPA and built between institutions. In fact, they had point-to-point internet. Network access. Right, the network in the school, Stanford. Point-to-point was so that Stanford would have a network on campus, right, and the wires would connect everybody so that they could get access to the library and Stanford resources, and then they started connecting Stanford to Berkeley to UCLA. So the schools were all networked, but that was for academic research. They could, and I can tie this together because this, what Google did. Well, first of all, Sun Microsystems, Sun is Stanford University Network.
Oh, interesting.
And they started in like the early 90s, And a lot of the reason that schools started buying Sun Microsystems computers, workstations, is because they were relatively high speed and directly connected to other institutions. And then companies started buying them because they saw what the institutions were doing, the academic ones. And so then what Google did, and this is almost a direct thing because John Doerr Kleiner invested in Sun. So he saw what was going on, and then he invested in Google. And what Google did was they started on the Stanford University network as a search for searching the internet, right? But the internet included all the other academic institutions at the time. And so the fundamental algorithm that Google started with was this PageRank. And what they were doing was they were looking at academic papers and seeing how many people had linked to them in the internet as it was then. And they used that to determine the likelihood that you would want that paper when you went looking for stuff. And they used PageRank for general searching. That's why Google came out of the gate so fast, because they were already doing it on the Stanford University network, which was largely using Sun Microsystems workstations. And Sergey and Larry were PhD candidates at Stanford, so they were doing it themselves, right? And they generalized that concept of using the number of links to a document to determine how likely it would be that that's what you're looking for. And they generalized that to everything. And as the public internet started to happen, that was the fastest way to search for stuff. I mean, Yahoo had already gotten there and they were doing kind of normal search, and Google just overwhelmed them.
Yeah, because there was search. And so it was before 1997 that I got access to the internet, because I remember using Alta Vista. I remember using Yahoo. And yeah,
Alta Vista was the other search, and they just failed to commercialize. They could have competed with Google. It was as, high performance. That what came out of Digital Equipment Corporation.
So going back to the office where you got the floppy disk, at that point, how did that office get connected to this direct network that was the internet?
Well, our IT department was already using it, sort of unbeknownst to us, right? The IT department was already using the internet because they knew about what was going on in the schools. Our IT department was the IT department for InfoWorld. InfoWorld was owned by IDG. IDG also had Computer World and massive number of other publications. So at some level, the IT departments were cooperating with each other to transfer files.
So they were using the proto-internet. They were using an intranet.
Yeah, but we didn't actually call it that then. But that process was largely, you'd open the terminal program on Windows. Windows was trying to be graphic, but it was still DOS. And you'd open the terminal program and you go file transfer : / blah blah this and that, right? And you could transfer a file from InfoWorld to Computer World.
But it wasn't an intranet. It was a network. It was a private network.
It was using the internet because there was this very fuzzy time. This is I didn't actually know this was going on. I only learned about it afterwards. But there was this fuzzy time between 1994 and 1993 and 1995, where people started using the internet as the public internet, but it was still not for profit. You weren't allowed to charge for it. So, and there was a change in rule sometime in 94, 95 that allowed you to start charging for it. AOL was a proprietary thing. You dialed into it on a modem, and that's probably how you got access to it. And CompuServe, and there were these people that had figured out how to use a modem to connect to other stuff. But then the internet started. And it was not fast. You often used a modem to get to the internet. And there were these companies that started as not-for-profit companies. It's very interesting given OpenAI, but started as not-for-profit companies and then converted to being for-profit so that they could charge money.
Commercialize the internet. So
yeah.
There is some regulation. This is brilliant territory. I'm really glad we did this one. There's some regulation that made the United States that decided to have a free and open internet rather than the proprietary one. What was that
That came
regulation?
later. The internet was the original internet, the network between academic institutions, um, was started as an open internet, right? Because there was no commercial application for it.
Mhm.
And then it became commercial. And it wasn't until much later that the FTC,
Uh-huh.
DC, one of them, and that was a political issue, and that happened in the late 90s, where the government said this should remain this way. And there is a Communications Act of something or other that
Looking it up right now.
that set that principle, and people challenged it from time to time, but including after social media started happening, and people are going, well, you know, these companies are doing all this hateful stuff. Why can't we control that? And it's the platform rule that if platform you're not responsible for what's published
So it's the
on your platform.
So the FCC, the 1996 Telecommunications Act in the U.S. embraced a distinction between traditional telecommunications serving and emerging information services, with lighter regulation applied to information services like the internet. So in 1996 was the pivotal moment. In 2010, the FCC issued its first open internet order, which established rules against blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization of internet traffic.
Yeah.
And then there's also
all of that's the foundation on which everything else has been built, all the challenges and court rulings and stuff like that. We still have a fundamental rule that the internet is open, which is not true in China. China has the massive firewall, and they put people in jail if they violate the rules. It's like a completely different system.
And did you see that there's now proof that the American system is better than the Chinese system, because the Chinese system basically just wiped out their entire startup market by saying it's not your money, it's our money. And so that's
very recent. Yeah. Because what happened in China was these internet entrepreneurs started to do the same thing in China that ours did. They were like late.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They had a pristine market of 1.3 billion people, and they became fabulously wealthy. And that was the problem.
Ooh, interesting. They were turning into Elon Musk. Basically.
Yeah. So there's and I don't know the characters as well in China, but like Joseph Ma, I think his name is
Jack Ma.
Jack Ma, who started not ByteDance, Tencent. No, I can't. I can't throw them out.
Alibaba.
Yeah. So they had the same thing happen, and Xi Jinping was sitting there going, "This is ridiculous. These people are getting rich, and they're not under my control." So he had established control, and it went through various stages. So I just read somewhere yesterday that in like 5 years ago, 15,000 companies got started in China, and last year there were 1,000.
A Financial Times article. There's a Financial Times article that just has this just horrible graph of 2021, 2020, 21, 22, and then nothing. In the last 2 years, there have been
just clamped down.
Yeah.
They can do that.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is the argument people argue back and forth right now. China is looking kind of smart because they bet on certain technologies 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And we're out there being free market, and we're kind of catching up, particularly in the military. Although that's a whole nother topic.
We can do that one next time about Anduril and all the deep tech companies in El Segundo and the very interesting political climate. You actually made an Instagram comment. Maybe we can end with this last 5-10 minutes or so. You made an interesting Instagram comment on your way to Montana on September 11th. And you said, it's a crazy world. I want to hear what the crazy world you think is.
Well, I was in Montana fishing on 9/11, 2001, which is when the World Trade Center was destroyed by airplanes. So I was in Montana in the middle of nowhere. 4 hours from the closest commercial airport, but they had satellite TV. So, we're sitting there, and it happened like at 8 a.m. on the East Coast. So it was like 6 a.m. in Montana. And so somebody kind of ran across the compound and said, we're under attack. quote unquote. And people are going like, what do you mean we're under attack? And so we all gathered in the one cabin that had the satellite TV connection, and we watched both buildings fall down. So this is like, what? Like, we did not expect that kind of thing to happen. And so we Americans at first reacted and bonded together, but then people started going, oh, well, how the hell did we allow that to happen? And there's an element of mistrust that's become much more common of our ability now to figure this out is much better than it was 23 years ago. So I realized as I was taking off from San Francisco that I was flying to Montana on 9/11 of 2024, 23 years later. So I'm going to Montana, and it just made me start thinking about what's the difference between 2001
the big difference.
And 2024. Well, Ukraine, Hamas, Gaza, China. The fact that China shut its borders down, well, not borders, but shut its economy down. All of this craziness out in the world. And it's like, that did not happen 23 years ago.
So it's so interesting reading about my grandfather and great uncle Joe right now, because the world that they helped build, which was beautiful, like Camelot, having this JFK, like that sort of renaissance of American, like America is here, it's finally come, and all these promises and all these beautiful things that were promised in that epic. And then, the 90s happened. Something interesting happened in the 90s. The internet happened. That was really cool. And then 2001 changed everything. And now today, everything's changed. And it wasn't, in the 90s, it felt like it was over. History's over. Even Francis Fukuyama wrote the book, The End of History. He didn't mean that in the way that most people thought it was meant. But yeah, everything's really different now. And the internet's going to change a lot more things. Like, we haven't even understood the impact of the internet as it is today. And now we got AI. So it's all going to change. But it's a very interesting time. May you live in interesting times. So,
well, the way I put that is the period of time from 1920 to 1941 was really interesting, because the 1920s were the roaring 20s. But the economies around the world were just going nuts.
Electricity.
In an unsustainable way, but manufacturing everything. But it's the flappers and at least in the US. And then the Depression happened, 1929, the major stock crash, because there were no guardrails, and it went from like 100 to 10 in one day. And that had this rolling effect through the whole economy. And it was worldwide, but it was particularly in the US. So then we went through the Depression, Herbert Hoover and blah, blah, blah. And then, like, it was a really bad time, like 30% unemployment, people, begging for food. It was a terrible time. And we got saved by World War II because we went to war. We, set up we were already a manufacturing country, but we just used all of our manufacturing to make tanks and boats and airplanes, and we won World War II, right? And we came back from World War II, and we made it really easy for the vets to get an education and to get jobs. And so, we went into this amazing economy in the 50s and 60s. The change point there is the 60s, because we went to war in Vietnam, and that was like, we kind of did, well, we did it in Korea, we did it in, Europe. Well, we can go to Vietnam, take care of this. And that turned out to be a disaster. And then Kennedy got assassinated. Bobby Kennedy got assassinated, Martin Luther King. So the whole devolution from the 60s to now, it's all of a piece. And what was not understood about, our magical economy in the 50s and 60s is that there was a lot of stuff under the cover that was not good. Like all those prototypical families with the 2.5 kids and the white picket fence. The husband, was working his butt off and drinking heavily and beating up kids and his wife. And the wives were like, didn't have any empowerment and really were kind of housemakers, but they were drinking too. And so everybody, this is like, no one's really written that
Yeah.
part of the history because it was all there. It wasn't like Vietnam was suddenly, a change from before. It was just that we assumed too much about our ability to manage this magical society, and it's all devolved from there to the point where we don't trust our government, we don't trust our big companies, we don't trust anybody, anything. And we're sitting here like going, well, who are you going to believe? I mean, Donald Trump's crazy, but what the hell?
Everyone
We're all
else is
crazy.
crazy too. Yeah.
So it's all of a piece from 1945 to 2025. It's all the same thing.
That's why I started. That's why I named it Crazy Wisdom.
Yeah.
Because everyone's crazy now. That's the whole. That's the zeitgeist is that everyone's crazy, and at least we know it. So there's some wisdom. Well, that was really fun.
Yeah,
Next time we'll talk about
back to your grandfather. I mean, because he and your uncle, great uncle, Joe, documented the underside. Joe McCarthy,
oh, interesting.
atomic weapons. I mean, they were talking about the stuff that really mattered. The Ku Klux Klan. Your grandfather went down and spent a week with the Ku Klux Klan talking to the Grand Dragon or whatever the hell they call him, and they talked about the stuff that really mattered.
And do you have those articles?
I do. I have every single one of them.
Yeah, we gotta figure out a programmatic solution to get those articles on the internet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was a fun one. Thank you so much.